Um, so we'll go to 1971 in Attica. Okay, Mona. Take care. In Attica, this is in New York. There was a it's called a few different names: a rebellion, a massacre, an uprising, a riot. It was a prison riot in which 43 people died. There were 10 hostages. Then all but one guard and 3 inmates were killed by law enforcement when the state retook control of the prison on the last day of the uprising. Now, when this news story went out and such, part of the question it was like, well, what were they fighting for? And I wanted to go over their manifesto because I find it very illuminating. Because they're not asking for anything incredible or extraordinary. And it really, to me, highlights just how fucked up we treat and dehumanize prisoners. So, yeah, both police and gangs were especially bad in the 70s in New York. That hasn't really changed much. Police still are extremely violent and dehumanizing towards prisoners and stuff. It might be a little hard to read, but, you know, I'll be reading it. I'll get to that, Gravy. Close the page view for a better size. Okay, there we go. Few among us really know what life in Attica prison or any prison is like. And no doubt, many of us would have assumed that what the Attica inmates demanded was already granted as a matter of course in an institution that is supposed to return men to society as healthy, responsible members. For this reason, we have included in this fund appeal a summary of the petition that Attica prisoners addressed to the governor, the Department of Corrections, and others last July. It is through their demands that we get a glimpse of the conditions that were the seedbed for rebellion. But what is most striking in the statement of demands is what it reveals about the men who produced it, for it shows that the prisoners themselves are seriously concerned with their own rehabilitation. Thus, the demands could be read as the conditions they see as necessary for producing that end, and their very formulation should be seen as an assertion of dignity and personal worth. This preamble is important. I think it's vitally important because if someone is telling you the treatment that they are being given is not working, and they suggest things that they say would help them to grow as people, you should consider that. You should at least consider that, rather than just ordering them all, which is ultimately what happened. The Attica Liberation Faction Manifesto of Demands and Anti-Depression Platform. We, the imprisoned men of Attica Prison, seek an end to the injustice suffered by all prisoners, regardless of race, creed, or color. The preparation and content of this document has been constructed under the unified efforts of all races and social segments of this prison. It is a matter of documented record and human recognition that the administration of the New York State prison system have restructured the institutions which were designed to socially correct men into the fascist concentration camps of modern America. Due to the conditional fact that Attica Prison is one of the most classic institutions of authoritative inhumanity upon man. The following manifesto of demands are being submitted. The inmates of this prison have vested the power of negotiation regarding the settlement of the stipulated demands within the judgment and control of these men. 5 names here redacted. All and any negotiation will be conducted by prison and state authorities with these 5 men. These demands are being presented to you. There is no strike of any kind to protest these demands. We are trying to do this in a democratic fashion. We feel there is no need to dramatize our demands. We, the men of Attica Prison, have committed to the New York State Department of Correction by the people of society for the purpose of correction what has been deemed as social errors in behavior. Errors which have classified us as socially unacceptable until reprogramming with new values and more thorough understanding as to our value and responsibility as members of the outside community. The Attica Prison program, in its structure and conditions, has been enslaved on the pages of this manifesto of demands with the blood, sweat, and tears of the inmates of this prison. The programs which we are submitted to under the facade of rehabilitation is relative to the ancient stupidity of pouring water on a drowning man, inasmuch as we are treated for our hostilities by our program administrators with their hostility as medication. In our efforts to comprehend on a feeling level an existence contrary to violence, we are confronted by our captors with, as to what is fair and just, we are victimized by the exploitation and the denial of the celebrated due process of law. So what they're saying, what they're basically saying here is many of us were arrested for violence, and in this place, we are only being treated with more violence. This ain't it. In our peaceful efforts to assemble in dissent, as provided under this nation's constitution, we are in turn murdered, brutalized, and framed on various criminal charges because we seek the rights and privileges of all American people. In our efforts to intellectually expand in keeping with the outside world through all categories of news media, we are systematically restricted and punitively offended to isolation on status when we insist on our human rights to the wisdom of awareness. And this one is saying that many of them want to know what's going on in the world. They want to read. They want to keep up so that if they do get released, they won't have to play catch up. They're being kept in the dark where the only thing that they know is prison and denied access to anything else. Now, I'm going to keep in mind that this list of demands are things that at the time they did not have, and most of these prisoners still don't have. And I want you to think about what life would be without these such things. We demand the constitutional rights of legal representation at the time of all parole board hearings and the protection from the procedure of the parole authority, whereby they permit no procedural safeguards such as an attorney for cross-examinations of witnesses in behalf of the parolee at parole revocation hearings. Okay, so, what is a parole hearing, where you're trying to argue that, look, I've served like 80% of my term. Well, they're being asked to be their own legal representative in front of a parole board that has absolute authority and cannot be appealed or questioned. So they, with no legal experience themselves, have to try to make legal arguments to an indifferent board that has no oversight or legal counsel on how they can best affect their own defense. This is still very common. They would often be denied any expert on their situation. Yeah. Right. Wouldn't even give written documents. Yeah. We demand a change in medical policy and procedure, and in medical staff. The Attica Prison Hospital is totally inadequate, understaffed, prejudiced in the treatment of inmates. There are numerous mistakes made many times. Improper and erroneous medication is given by untrained personnel. We also demand periodical checkups on all prisoners and sufficient licensed practitioners 20 hours a day instead of inmate help that is used now. This should be a no-brainer. If you are taking full responsibility for the lives of people, and they can't even, go to a hospital, you need to basically be a hospital. You need to be able to 24/7 provide actual professional medical care to everyone in your charge. That not only this is not done, but that they rely on untrained inmates to do often their own medical care for each other is medical negligence, is the nicest way to put it. We demand adequate visiting conditions and facilities for the inmates and families of Attica prisoners. The visiting facilities at this prison are such as to preclude adequate visiting for the inmates and their families. So this is one that I've talked to Derek Davis about a fair bit, about how, even just talking to him on the phone, he's restricted to 15 minutes exactly. Actual visits are extremely brief and have to be, scheduled well in advance. Access to correspond at all is extremely limited, and is, subject to surveillance at all times. I don't know exactly what their vision of adequate visiting conditions is, but yeah, if you have to go through a bunch of hoops to have, 15 minutes in a concrete room with someone, or sometimes even just to see them through ballistic glass, I wouldn't call that an adequate visit for if your function is to heal them, right? They should actually be able to maintain some degree of relationships. That is part of the human experience. Being denied that is not helpful toward that end. If your goal, on the other hand, is just to punish them and turn them into animals by treating them as such, then yeah, that's what you do. Keep them in isolation, don't let them maintain relationships, etc. Yeah, it's supposed to be a reward for good behavior. I think it should just be part of their treatment, because it is fundamentally a healthy thing. We demand an end to the segregation of prisoners from the mainline population because of their political beliefs. Some of the men in segregation units are confined there solely for political reasons, and their segregation from other inmates is indefinite. You'd like to think that this one doesn't apply anymore. You'd be wrong. People not only Muslims and Hebrews, but people like even Russell Shoatz were kept separate from other prisoners all the way from interacting with the broader prison population, and frequently moved between prisons to prevent him from ever like organizing prisoners as a former Black Panther member, all the way up to his death last December. This was true of several former Black Panther members, and it's true of several, yeah, incarcerated Muslims. It's true of many political organizers who have been arrested in the course of social movements. Where they are just not allowed to speak because the prison is afraid of them exposing other people to any ideas or truths that they may have. Now, those policies are intended to prevent something like this Attica prison riot from happening, because if you keep people separated and prevent them from talking and organizing, it makes it real hard to create a movement to challenge the power structures. But these brave folks actually tried. We demand an end to the persecution and punishment of prisoners who practice the constitutional right of peaceful dissent. Prisoners of Attica and other New York State prisons cannot be compelled to work, as these prisons were built for the purpose of housing prisoners, and there is no mention as to the prisoners being required to work on prison jobs or in order to remain in the mainline population and or be considered for release. This gets into slave labor. This is still very much a practice today. Many prisoners believe their labor power is being exploited in order for the state to increase its economic power. They're right. And to continue to expand its correctional industries, which are million-dollar complexes, yet do not develop working skills acceptable for employment in the outside society, and which do not pay the prisoners more than 50 cents a day, which remains true today. Prisoners who refuse to work for the outrageous scale or who strike are punished and segregated without the access to privileges shared by those who do work. This is class legislation, class division, and creates hostilities within the prison. So, there is no way to interpret this besides slave labor. If you take someone, you put them into a cage, and you give them a choice to go into solitary, effectively, or work for 50 cents a day at most, which is a pittance and is then reclaimed by the prison for basic amenities. Yeah, there's no way to interpret that other than slave labor. That is coerced labor for, extremely grossly negligent pay. We demand an end to political persecution, racial persecution, and I know it's in the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, it's enshrined in the 13th. Racial persecution and the denial of prisoners' rights to subscribe to political papers, books, or any other educational and current media chronicles that are forwarded through the U.S. mail. Yeah. This was, of course, very much in the height of the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, when Black prisoners especially were trying to stay educated on various, thinkers and such. And this sort of denial is still very much a thing. It's difficult to get access to books and such in prison. Derek was describing that his choices have to be approved, and there's no like list of banned books per se. It's just up to the sole discretion of the prison apparatus to decide what is acceptable and what is unacceptable for him to read. You can imagine how this might manifest in trying to thought control prisoners and what they think about such. We demand that industries be allowed to enter the institutions and employ inmates to work 8 hours a day and fit into the category of working men for scale wages. The working conditions in prisons do not develop working incentives parallel to the many jobs in the outside society, and a paroled prisoner faced many contradictions of the job that adds to his difficulties in adjusting. Those industries outside who desire to enter prisons should be allowed to enter for the purposes of employment placement. Okay, so here they're saying prison labor, first of all, it's slave labor, the way we're being used. Secondly, it would be healthy for us to work alongside free people on a paroled basis in a work facility that wants to contract us for scale wages, for the actual wages that that work would be worth. And they're correct that if the only work you know is the type of work that is and structure of work that is done inside of a prison facility, you will be ill-suited to apply for jobs and work those jobs once you are released. If your goal, again, is to heal prisoners and prepare them to coexist in society, and you deny them this, you deny them any sort of semblance of a normal working condition, you are not achieving that goal. We demand that inmates be granted the right to join or form labor unions. They should be able to negotiate for their own working conditions. If you're curious what not being able to advocate for your own working conditions looks like, we saw a tragic example of this past hurricane season when that candle factory refused to let their inmate workers leave the premises and were subsequently killed when the building was crushed by a tornado. They said, "We do not care about the weather conditions. We own you. You stay here." They had no ability to argue or negotiate that. We demand that inmates be granted the right to support their own families. At present, thousands of welfare recipients have to divide their checks to support their imprisoned relatives who, without the outside support, cannot even buy toilet articles or food. Men working on scale wages could support themselves and families while in prison. This is a really important one. So, one of the things that, like, you know, especially racists love to do is say, oh, look at all these, you know, black families that only have like a single mother. Where are all the black fathers? Like, that's their rallying cry or whatever to call out how bad black people are, basically. And I know it doesn't just impact black people, but I wanted to highlight that that is one of the big things that gets talked about. If this demand were true, if they worked scale wages while in prison and had the ability to send part of their wages back to their families, a lot of these broken households would be in a much less dire situation. It would also create some more unity in that family that would allow them to continue to maintain some kind of mutually beneficial relationship, even through incarceration, and potentially increase the likelihood of being rejoined as a family without the incarcerated purely being perceived as a burden. There's a lot of benefits that would come from this. We demand that correctional officers be prosecuted as a matter of law for any act of cruel and unusual punishment where it is not a matter of life or death. We demand that all institutions using inmate labor be made to conform with the state and federal minimum wage laws. I don't know why that's controversial, but apparently it is. If one's knee-jerk reaction is, well, they're paying their debt to society. No, them being incarcerated is paying their debt to society. They don't have a financial burden above and beyond that. We demand an end to the escalating practice of physical brutality being perpetuated upon the inmates of New York State prisons. Should go without saying, but apparently it needs saying. Given the number of people who die in prison at the treatment of guards and wardens and such, apparently it needs saying a lot. When companies contract prison labor, they are paying the prison a ton of money for it. Yeah, it's pure profit for the prisons, and it's profitable for the companies. All for slave labor. We demand the appointment of 3 lawyers from the New York State Bar Association to full-time positions for the provision of legal assistance to inmates seeking post-conviction relief, and to act as a liaison between the administration and inmates for bringing inmate complaints to the attention of the administration. This is vital in any sort of structure where you are taking on the responsibility of someone. Even if you set up a structure like something closer to what Norway has, where your goal is to affect the healing of those within it, even if they address everything else, you do need an outside body who is not invested in the power structure of that facility, who's not employed by that facility, to be the one to carry complaints and such. Because if they're, have absolute control of those within their facility, it's very difficult to go to them and point out problems to the facility itself. Many companies have, like an HR department. Some of them work well, some of them don't, but you still have some sort of third body that is supposed to be not neutral, but kind of on the side of those who the more powerful structure is responsible for, to make sure that they are being fair to those that it's in charge of, right? We demand the updating of industry working conditions to the standards provided for under New York State law. If you have a bunch of safety standards and such, and they don't apply to prisoners, you don't have safety standards. We demand the establishment of inmate workers' insurance plans to provide compensation for work-related accidents. We demand the establishment of unionized vocational training programs comparable to that the federal prison system, which provided for union instructions, union pay scales, and union membership upon completion of the vocational training course. We demand annual accounting of the inmates' recreation fund and formulation of an inmate committee to give inmates a voice as to how such funds are used. We demand that the present parole board appointed by the governor be eradicated and replaced by a parole board elected by popular vote of the people. In a world where many crimes are punished by indeterminate sentences and where authority acts with secrecy and within vast discretion, and given heavy weight to accusations by prison employees against inmates, inmates feel trapped unless they are willing to abandon their desire to be independent men. So what is this? This is an interesting one because they're saying basically the parole board acts like a judge and a courtroom. And judges tend to be voted for by the population. Currently, the parole board is just an appointed position. This remains true in most states. And like I said, they have very, very extreme discretion. If they are performing their job in a really sketchy way, there's no way to change that. You could change the governor, but like people should have some. If it is being effectively a courtroom, it makes sense that people should be able to vote for a parole board as well. We demand that the state legislature create a full-time salaried board of overseers for the state prisons. The board would be responsible for evaluating allegations made by inmates, their families, friends, and lawyers against employees charged with acting inhumanely, illegally, or unreasonably. The board should include people nominated by a psychological or psychiatric association, by the State Bar Association, or by Civil Liberties Union, and by groups of concerned involved laymen. For a long time, the Florida Parole Board just didn't bother meeting for months. Yeah. They don't have to. There's nothing to compel them currently. Yeah, and this is again saying we need a group that is not run by the prison to be an oversight for the prison. We demand an immediate end to the agitation of race relations by the prison administration of this state. We demand the Department of Corrections furnish all prisoners with the services of ethnic counselors for the needed special services of the brown and black populations of this prison. This is, we talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago when we identified that there are some major changes, differences between the way that white pastors approach Christianity and like black pastors do. Now, not just Christianity, obviously other faiths exist there as well. And if they're not, able to provide these services and such, then you're not able to fairly treat or represent people that are in your care. Demand an end to the discrimination in the judgment and quota of parole for black and brown people. This is very much a problem still today. If you look at parole statistics, it is granted white people are granted far more parole leniency than black or brown people are. Like, it's not even close. We demand that all prisoners be present at the time their cells and property are being searched by the correctional officers of state prisons. Because shit kept getting stolen. Still happens today. Stuff gets stolen and destroyed by correctional officers. We demand an end to the discrimination against prisoners when they appear before a parole board. Most prisoners are denied parole solely because of their prior record. Life sentences should not be confined longer than 10 years, as 7 years is the considered statute for a lifetime out of circulation. But if a man cannot be rehabilitated after a maximum of 10 years of continuous constructive programs, then he belongs in a mental hygiene center, not a prison. This is an interesting evocation here. So, what they're alluding to is like the legally, if you're considering like statutes of limitations and things, 7 years is considered a lifetime ago in a lot of legal doctrine, and things done 7 years ago, you're not legally liable for anymore, right? You can run down the statute of limitations clock. If that holds true, the argument therefore should be maximum sentence should be around 7 years. They'll go as far as 10. Because if it's good enough for you to forget about a crime, forget that happened 10 years ago, legally, it should be good enough that you should be able to rehabilitate someone within 10 years. If not, if the person is still under a constructive system, unable to coexist in society, they shouldn't be in prison because it's not working. They should be in a professional setting, like a mental hygiene center. I think it's a strong argument and a very interesting one, a very thoughtful one. We demand an end to the unsanitary conditions that exist in the mess hall. Dirty trays, dirty utensils, stained drinking cups, and an end to the practice of putting food on the tables hours before eating time without any protective covering put over it. Yeah. We demand that better food be served to the inmates. The food is a gastronomical disaster. We also demand that drinking water be put on each table and that each inmate be allowed to take as much food as he wants and as much bread as he wants, instead of the severely limited portions and limited slices of bread. Inmates wishing a pork-free diet should have one, since 85% of our diet is pork meat or pork-saturated food. There's many religious folks who don't eat pork, or just for dietary reasons they don't want pork. Also, one thing that comes to mind with Norway is it is a socially normal thing for people to be able to decide what they want to eat. It's one of the many small things that you can do to continue to have someone live with dignity and be able to think for, function and have some independence. We demand that there be one set of rules governing all prisons in this state instead of the present system where each warden makes the rules for his institution as he sees fit. Holy hell, this is still a problem. And why is it still a problem? What's interesting about prisons being so decentralized is the reason you decentralize is to avoid accountability, typically. If you think about like terror cells and stuff, They don't want a singular head because that way you can attack the head, right? So if you have a bunch of independent cells operating with their own rules, their own leaders, etc., you're just playing whack-a-mole with, lots of... The same is true of prisons, if you're adopting this structure. We further demand that the Commissioner of Correctional Services direct the superintendents of all correctional facilities to abolish all archaic rules and policies now in effect, and to update such rules and policies to present-day standards. At present, each and every correctional facility in New York State is run by the superintendent as he so desires, and without question, e.g. Attica Correctional Facility. The following ills exist which require immediate correction. If an inmate buys or orders an item in one prison and is subsequently transferred to another, the item brought may not be permitted in the second prison due to the new prison's policies. For example, inmates are allowed to purchase aerosol shaving cream in the Clinton CF commissary, order linoleum for his cell floor, and purchase a jacket to wear. If he is transferred to Attica, these will be confiscated by the authorities here, and the inmate is faced with the choice of having his property destroyed or sent home at his own expense without any reimbursement. They just rob prisoners of their meager belongings. Food packages from home containing cooked fowl are only allowed on certain holidays instead of monthly, and cigarettes are not allowed in through packages. Items that will spoil when opened, if not refrigerated, are opened in the package room. If an inmate receives a canned ham during the warm weather, he must eat the whole ham before it spoils, because they're not supplied with refrigerator access. Inmates are provided with only one roll of toilet paper every 5 weeks. I want you at home to consider if you would go through a toilet roll every 5 weeks. And we cannot get any additional toilet paper until the next issue date, unless we steal it or spend what little money we have in purchasing this item in the prison commissary. Nor is toilet tissue provided in the recreation yard toilets. Inmates can get haircuts only once a month. It cannot grow out their hair to whatever length they want to. Nor are inmates allowed to grow mustaches unless within a few weeks of release, and beards are outlawed completely. I don't know if that one is still true around or not. Razor blades are not provided by the institution. Inmates must buy razor blades, have them sent in by package, or go to the institution barbershop to be shaved. When razor blades are purchased in the commissary or received in a package, they're held by authorities. They're issued 5 blades every 3 weeks in exchange for the used blades. Lockers are not provided in certain cell blocks. Blown fuses are replaced twice weekly, are only replaced twice a week. Hot water for drinking and washing in the evenings is brought around to the cells in unsanitary and rusty buckets. Showers are allowed only once a week. The mainline population, including the metal plant workers who sweat and get dirty daily. Commissary prices have risen along with inmate pay increases, so that our buying power remains static. Certain items sold for holidays and certain items being brought in large volume have heavily marked up prices. Food and beverages which require cooking are sold at the commissary, but no stoves are provided for cooking these items. Institutional issued coats are not allowed in the mess hall. One must leave them in the hall on the floor before entering the mess hall. Inmates are required to respond to the banging of the officer's billy on the walls on the command to march, stop, or to be quiet. Sugar is non-existent in the mess hall. One television is placed in the recreation yard to be viewed there the year round. Programs are chosen by the administrator instead of by the inmates. Typewriters are not allowed to inmates in order for them to perfect their appeals or to type up petitions concerning their case, nor is there any institutional process except to pay for them to get legal work typed. Bodybuilders and weightlifters are not provided with regulation weights. Instead, they must use makeshift weights with cement encased in vegetable cans and use any iron bar that can be gotten. There is no running hot water in the cells. Movies are stopped in April and begin again in October, instead of being shown the year round. When movies are shown, the inmates desiring not to attend are penalized by having to stay in their cells until the movies are over. So, that was the Attica Prison Manifesto of Dreams and Anti-Depression platform. Nothing they called for was that outrageous. This is what they were slaughtered for, all but 3 of them. These are the things that the prison was willing to kill every last one of them for. I mean, the 3 survived, but not for lack of trying. So, when I say that the prison is a rubbish system, and that police and prisons need to be abolished, and that we need to refocus what we're doing, this is the shit that I'm talking about.